Today we are interviewing Richard A. Leiter, who is Professor of Law and Director of the Marvin and Virginia Schmid Law Library at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Richard, or Rich as you are usually known, I believe those watching or reading this interview would like to know a little bit about you personally. For example, could you begin by telling us about where you were raised and about your family, both when you were young and today?
Sure, happy to. And thank you, first of all, for interviewing me for this project. It's really a privilege to be able to contribute this. And it's a fascinating project. Well, let's see, I was born and raised in California. My third generation, I'm actually third generation Californian. My great-grandfather moved to Southern California, to LA, Los Angeles. And my father was born in Pismo Beach, a little beach community north of Santa Barbara. My grandfather laid the first sidewalk in Pismo Beach, California. I'm not sure that sidewalk is still there, but early pioneers, I guess you might say. I'm the only one of my family who does not still live in California, and my family all thinks I'm crazy for ever leaving. That's such as it is. But I was born in Sacramento. My parents moved to Santa Clara County, near San Jose, a little town called Campbell, California, in the middle of the apricot and cherry orchards. And that's where I grew up. Went to high school, Los Gatos High School, which is the little town just over the mountain from Santa Cruz, California. I grew up as a surfer. Before I could drive, me and my friends used to bum rides from older brothers and parents to get us over the mountain to Santa Cruz to surf. And then as soon as I was old enough to drive, did it myself, sometimes before school. Those were the days. And I then went to college, started out in a little town called Ashland, Oregon, Southern Oregon. At the time, the college was known as Southern Oregon College. I believe it's now a university, University of Southern Oregon. It's changed names a couple of times. Went there for a couple of years. I was a fine arts major, majored in painting and sculpture largely, and creative writing. And then I transferred back to California, graduated from the University of California at Santa Cruz, double degree in anthropology and religious studies. Now the reason that I started out as a fine arts major but graduated in religious studies and anthropology is because I was fearful of not being able to make a living as a painter or as a writer. So I went into more practical pursuits, religious studies and anthropology, that didn't have many more prospects. But after I graduated, I taught English in Indonesia, West Sumatra, for a year, just for adventure. Came back and moved to Los Angeles, intending to become a writer. And it was there that I learned about the field of law librarianship and ended up going to law school in Los Angeles, Southwestern University, and then anticipating a question coming up about how I got started in the career. They're kind of intermingled. I got my library degree at the University of Texas. And so, do you want me to
Keep
launch
going.
right in?
You're doing
Yeah.
just fine.
So I moved to Los Angeles with the intention of becoming a writer. And in my defense, I was young and a little naive. But it's embarrassingly naive. I expected to move to Los Angeles and then just look in the paper for ads looking for writers, excuse me, and that I could just apply for jobs as writers, and then I would make money writing because I was a good writer, and I thought that's how it worked. I was a little surprised when I kept tracking down job opportunities, word of mouth for the most part, and I got plenty of job offers, but none of them paid. They were all freelance jobs that is, they didn't pay up front. I remember sitting in an office of the Peterson Group, Peterson Publications. They owned a whole bunch of magazines, and the editor hiring me, in quotes, to cover a drag race in Long Beach, and told me what they wanted and how they had the approach they were going to take, and how long the article should be, and then said, well, send it to us when you're done. And so I asked, how should I pay for the entry fee into the to the track and into the races, and pay for expenses, and I had to provide my own photographs and things like that. He looked at me like I was crazy. He said, they don't pay until after I submit the article. That was a kind of a rude awakening for me. So it's difficult or it was difficult to make a living as a writer, because I kept getting paid after I did the work, and even then it was barely enough to live on. So all that is how I ended up getting a part-time job in a very large, pretty prestigious, posh law firm in the library, as a library sort of runner or research aide is what they called it. The name of the firm was Irell and Manella. It's a very well-known firm, and we had some very well-known clients. Groucho Marx was a client, Herb Alpert, A&M Records, Mattel Toys. It just goes on and on. Very famous people. But I remember walking into the library one day on my first day of work, and it was on the 7th floor of the building in Century City, LA, and it was a beautiful library, wood paneled and wood shelves and filled with books, and something resonated with me the second I walked in the door. Anyway, so it was a part-time job to start, but I just loved it, and it showed, apparently, because I began getting requests, more and more requests on the order of, we need to know what all the pharmacy regulations are on this particular topic in the Midwest. And so I had to go to the Los Angeles County Law Library and look up the laws. And they got less and less specific and more general and more interesting. And I ended up researching in libraries that I didn't even know existed in Southern California. The library of the California Thoroughbred Breeders Association, one of the libraries. And I met some fascinating people. In fact, I had to do some legislative histories at one point at the LA County Law Library, and the person who taught me how to do legislative histories was Frank Kodak, who at the time was a student intern at the LA County Law Library, and that's where I first met Frank, all those many years ago. And then I got to meet everybody at the LA County Law Library. I became a regular there. I met some great people, and some great people really worked at the LA County Law Library. After about 3 or 4 months, I was spending more time working on this than I was writing. And I went to my boss, Louise Lieb and Kathy Wilson, I believe were the two. Kathy, I can't believe I forgot her last name. Anyway, I went to Kathy and Louise. Louise Lieb, I think, is still at Nirel in Manila, one of my favorite firm librarian people. Favorite people, anyway. But went to them and said, is it possible to do this, working in law libraries as a career? And they both looked at me and laughed and said, well, sure, that's what we're doing. And so I asked them what I needed to do in order to prepare for it and do it. And they told me, Kathy said, if you really want to succeed or rise to the pinnacle of the profession, academics is where that was, and needed both a law degree and a library degree. That was how I got into the profession. At Nirel in Manila, after a few months, they made the position full-time. I went on full-time. They gave me a couple of raises and flipped a coin. I ended up going to law school first. I went to Southwestern University in Los Angeles, very old private law school in LA. My uncle, my grandfather's brother, actually went there and he pitched it to me. Did law school there. Had some great experiences. I ended up on Law Review. The editor-in-chief of the Law Review, and actually all my colleagues on the Law Review thought I was crazy because I was much more interested in organizing the Law Review's library than I was site-checking articles. And but anyway, that got through law school, moved to Northern California. After that, moved to San Jose. I had it up to my eyeballs in school by this point. So the prospect of going back to school to get a library degree just didn't sound like very much fun after law school. So I applied for, got a job as the firm librarian at a little boutique, high-tech business firm in San Jose, Hopkins, Mitchell and Carley. And I worked there for a couple of years. Applied for a job at Santa Clara University, and Mary Hood, who's the acting director at Santa Clara now, still laughs at the fact that I used to hang out at Santa Clara University Library frequently for special projects. I applied for a job there, and she wanted to hire me, but I didn't have a library degree, and so they couldn't. So she told me that I needed that, and my heart sank, but decided to bite the bullet and do it anyway. Then I started to get serious about library school, and then life started to get very interesting very quickly. I applied for a job at where you just came from, Pat, Southern Illinois University. Elizabeth Kelly was the director there. And I think they had a job open. And so I applied for the job. I sent her a letter and sent her my resume. And then I heard back from her fairly quickly that she was interested in me, but she wanted to talk to me. AALS was meeting in San Francisco at that time, and so she arranged to drive down from San Francisco to San Jose where we were working, or where I was, and went out to dinner and we talked. And it was at that time she told me that she had just been offered the job at Penn. She was moving to Penn, and said that she'd be really interested in hiring me, but I did need my library degree to keep Penn in mind. And they did have library school there, Drexel University, and but if I still wanted to go to Carbondale, she would work with me and make sure I had the connections to possibly go there, even without the degree, and earn it, so, you know, after the fact. So I then applied to library schools, and I was accepted at the library school in Washington, University of Washington, UCLA, and Drexel. That summer was the AALL annual meeting was in San Diego. And so I interviewed with, at Penn. They had a position open. I remember interviewing with the staff there, and one or two other places, but it was kind of foggy at the time. But at that meeting, there was a program that was offered that was called The Future of Law Librarianship. Caught my eye, and went to the program. I knew nobody at the time really in the profession, very few people. I'd actually gone up, made an appointment and met with Bob Baring at one point, talking about the profession, and so I sort of knew him. And he was president of AALL at the time. Anyway, at this program on the future of law librarianship, it was led by this sort of short, bearded man who commanded a lot of respect, obviously. And there were a lot of people who looked older, pretty distinguished looking group. In my memory, it was everybody that you have ever heard of, and you know, Morris Cohn, Bob, I don't know if Bob Baring was there, but a lot of old timers. And a lot of giants in the profession, but I didn't know who they were. So Roy stands up in front of the group, and the first thing he says is, "I don't like the seating arrangement. Everybody move your chairs into a big circle." And I thought, it's unusual, a little unorthodox, but everybody did. And then he started talking. He was walking around in the circle, and basically his pitch was, the era was quickly coming to an end of library directors having JDs and MLSs. In his view at that time, the future was going to be JD MBAs, much like hospital administrators had MBAs. He thought that's what the library of the future was going to be like. Who need business skills. Well, that was a little disappointing to me since I was just about to start in library school. After the program was over, he was surrounded by people who were talking to him and, you know, having a little back and forth, and I waited my turn and finally get up to the front, and I remember, you know, talking to him and finally saying, "Oh, Professor Mirsky, I'm really curious about what you're saying. How sure are you that this is what the future is going to look like?" And he looked at me and, "Who are you? Or, you know, why?" And I said, "Well, I'm about to go to library school, and so I'm concerned about whether I'm getting, into this profession with the right credentials. So he looked at me, and I remember vividly him kind of squinting. He was looking up at me. He was short, and but looking at me and really glaring, kind of staring into me, not in an unpleasant way, but really seeking me out. And he goes, "Well, what do you hope to accomplish? What do you want to do?" Nobody had ever asked me that. I said, "Well, I want to be a law librarian. I want to be a director someday. I want to be as good of a director as I can be." And I swear to God, this was one of those pivotal moments that comes along every so often in life. But he looked up at me and he goes, "If you want to be the best that you can be, you want to be the best director, come and work for me." And I remember looking at him saying, "What?" So I'd never heard of him. In my defense, I had no idea who Roy Mirsky was or what his reputation was. And I mean, I guess I knew that Texas had a university, but I didn't know anything about the University of Texas. So it was a shock. And make a sort of a long story, well, long, but an interesting story, a little bit shorter. He, right on the spot, gave me his card and took my information down and had me set up to do an interview. They were at the conference looking for a reference librarian. And so he arranged right there on the spot for me to be interviewed. I didn't have my library degree. And so I left the room shaken. My wife was with me, and she said, "Well, so how was the program?" And I said, "Well, I met this guy, and I'm interviewing for a job at the University of Texas." And she looked at me and, "What?" It was completely out of our plans. Nothing that we had been planning for led us south or to Texas. So I didn't know what to make of it. Well, I called a person the only person that I knew in the profession, who I thought might know something about this guy, Roy Mirsky, in the University of Texas, and somebody who had offered to mentor me, and that was Bob Baring. So I remember calling him from a house phone saying, and then getting him. He was president of AALL that summer, but he was in his room, and answered the phone, and I said, "Bob, I don't know if you remember me, I'm Rich Leiter." I came up to, and he did, he remembered me, and "What's up?" And I said, "Well," and I told him the story, that Roy Mirsky had, interviewed me and, or arranged for me to be interviewed. And so he said, "Well, hang on a second, I'll be right down." So he met and told me they didn't really have time to sit down and talk, but he'd get some people together to kind of counsel me or let me know what I was getting into or potentially getting into. He arranged for Jenny Parrish, who's now at Hastings, Terry Martin, who's at Harvard, and Tom Steele, who at the time was at Mississippi. They had all three worked for Roy in the past. Somehow Bob arranged for the three of them to meet me and my wife at the pool at the hotel, and we drank margaritas, and they told war stories. And I heard all about working at Texas and and what could come of it, and all about working for Roy. And it was a thrill, and I loved the people, Jenny, Tom, and Terry, all three of them. We just had a great time. And they all three concluded that I could probably survive there and make it be a good opportunity, good experience. And not too long after that, Roy offered me the job before the annual meeting was over. In fact, that's right, it was the day of the closing banquet. He offered me the job. And I said, well, but I've never been to Texas. I don't even know what it's like. And he said, you have 24 hours to decide. No, that's right, it was the day before the annual meeting that he offered me the job and said, you have 24 hours, take it or leave it, and no, I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna fly you out, for an interview. You either, you've heard what it's like, you either wanna come or you don't. And that was it. So I had 24 hours to make up my mind, sight unseen. I didn't know, I hadn't applied to library school there. And I guess one little more tidbit that's interesting about it. I suddenly show up in the suite where they're doing the interviews for the reference position. Bob Nissenbaum was the associate director at Texas at the time. So he was conducting the interviews, and there were other people there. I honestly don't have a recollection of who else was doing the interviews. So I don't know who else was there, but there were at least three other people. Anyway, I walk in, Bob had never seen my resume, but I brought it with me. And so I give it to him, and he was kind of rolling his eyes because they had already picked who they wanted to interview, and I was this guy that Roy just plucked out of thin air and sent him into the interview. So I show up, and Bob looks at it and says, you haven't been to library school? And I said, I know. And he said, the job isn't even open to people who don't have a library degree. And I said, well, I didn't apply for this job. Roy told me to come here. And Bob was annoyed, really annoyed. And so during the interview process, he said over and over again that they've never hired anybody in this position without both degrees, and he wasn't about to start it now, but he had kind of resigned himself to the fact that if Roy wanted me, he was going to do it. So when Roy offered me the job the next day, I remember him, coming up right close to me and kind of pointing his finger at me when he made the job offer, and he said, now, I've never hired anybody without a library degree, without both degrees. So if you come, I want you to get it as quickly as you can, full-time. But I'm going to work you full-time, you're going to go to school full-time, and you're not going to disappoint me. So those were the conditions under which I ended up going to Texas. It turned out to be just a marvelous, amazing experience in every way. I think I've gone on longer than the question should be.
No, you have done very well. Actually, you have brought in the fact that you had the opportunity to work with what I think everyone would agree is one of the most tremendous mentors that existed in our field during the era that you and I have been part of it, and
Yeah.
that's Roy Mirsky. And many people who had the opportunity to work at his library learned a great deal and then went on to top-notch careers, including yourself, Rich.
Mm-hmm.
It was tremendous. Aside from that, you and Roy have, over the later years, were involved in other projects. And one in particular comes to mind in that it eventually evolved into the Spirit of Law Librarianship Award, which is now appropriately named in Roy's honor.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about some of that? And
Sure.
perhaps specifically about the Spirit of Law Librarianship Award and what that's all about. I think many of our viewers might find that very interesting as well.
Sure. Yeah, going to Texas was a thrill, and in retrospect, I have no regrets about it whatsoever. The way that Roy and I began collaborating on different projects is kind of interesting. It was born largely out of fear and paranoia on my part. I had heard so many stories about how tough he could be and how scary he can be and how arbitrary he could be. But how good, and you rightly put it, that he was a gifted mentor. I mean, he didn't treat everybody the same. He was tough, but he was tough on just about everybody. He was a little different with everybody, and I don't know if there was much method to his techniques or not, but they were successful. So that's just predicate to say, when we first got to Texas, I was nervous about going to work there, and the pressures that were put on me by having to go to school full time, and even though library school isn't law school, it's school nonetheless, and then having me work full time. So he wasn't letting up, and he was being really careful not to show any favoritism. So I was nervous. So I thought that the best way to figure out how to make this work was to invite him over to dinner, over to our house. My wife's a pretty good cook, and so I walked into his office pretty early on and invited him to dinner. And he kind of was taken aback at first, but he looked at me and said, "Yeah, that sounds good. Let me invite some others on the staff." We ended up with a dinner party for 10 people. He invited Perrette Moreno and the other reference librarians, and so anyway, there were maybe not 10, but it was close. We were expecting dinner for 3, and it was quite a bit bigger. But that's how Roy was. But you know what? It turned out to be a really lucky stroke of good fortune on our part. Roy could be one of the most charming dinner guests that you would ever want to have in your house. He had good manners and he had good taste, but he had stories about the profession and things that he'd done and his travels and this and that. It was completely entertaining. It was so much fun. That got to be, during the 2.5 or 3 years that I was there at Texas, a tradition. Maybe once a month, every other month, we'd have Roy over and a sort of group of other people, and spouses from the library, and we just had a blast. And it kind of broke the ice, and so it got Roy and I, there was a little bit of a buffer. It did not shield me from getting yelled at or missing a deadline, and I got, raked across the coals many times in public. Roy was never shy about calling you on it, on your shortcomings or screw-ups or whatever. But he just seemed to have no inhibition about doing it in what other people would call appropriate situations. But he also had a tremendous insight into what the profession was like and what the goal of the profession was, serving people. He also encouraged everybody on his staff. If you came to him with an idea, a new service that you wanted to provide, or if you said, "Oh, I think that the microforms would work better if they were on the first floor," he would likely agree with you and then tell you to move it, to the first floor. So you had to be careful about the kinds of things that you suggested. You may end up having to do it, and he didn't always do it with support. He wouldn't necessarily go out and buy you the movers to move the things. That was one of the problems. I didn't have to move them to a different floor, just different part of the floor. But so he loved to experiment, and he loved the people that worked for him to experiment and test out their ideas. So the University of Texas, the Tarleton Law Library at the time was like a laboratory. The collections were moving floors, services were changing, and it was all done because he wanted to see how it would work. If it worked well, we did it. And if it didn't, he always reserved the right to say, "I told you so," and he did frequently. So it was a fun place, a very creative place. Roy also was the kind of person who had more ideas than could fit in any time period. So he'd call people in one right after another throughout the day with a list of projects. And I remember every time that you'd get called in to his office, walking out with a list of 5 or 6 new projects. Well, you knew that all 5 or 6 could not be accomplished by anybody or any group of people. Well, maybe a group of people, but more than one. So you had to figure out which ones were the most important to him and work on those first and try to get those accomplished before he ran out of patience to see whether the other ones did. I got very lucky in a lot of those situations, and he and I seemed to work well together. And so he would give me ideas, we'd collaborate on articles or projects, and then it just sort of grew like that. You mentioned the spirit of law librarianship was one of the funnest collaborations that he and I had. One of the things that was really unique and special about Roy and the kind of opportunities that he would give us, he would contact publishers or used book dealers. And for example, Oceana, he called Phil Cohn at Oceana and said, "Here, I'm mentoring this new kid." This was after I was a director on my own for a while. And how about you being Phil Cohen, fly the 2 of us to Dobbs Ferry, which is where Oceana was. And I'll introduce him to Oceana, look through your books, and he'll go through your collection and buy a bunch of books. That was the deal. From Roy's perspective, it was a free trip to see old friends, but also an opportunity to go through Oceana's unbelievably rich collection of used books to build his collection, and also an opportunity to mentor me and expose me to people and bibliography in ways that you couldn't otherwise. So he also arranged for a trip like that with Rothman. And I'd known Dick Spinelli already, but this was a trip where we went out and we met with Paul Rothman and Dick Spinelli. Paul took us through the warehouse and showed us the business. We went out to dinner with them. We went through the collection and did the same kind of thing. It was during that meeting that Roy pitched this idea. He had wanted to write or put together a book that was going to be a reader in law librarianship, like a case book for law librarians. And so he and Dick and I think Paul was in on the conversation, we started talking about what that book would look like. Now, I always knew, and anybody watching this who has worked with Roy knows that most collaborations where we're talking about what it's going to look like means that you are the one who's going to do the work. So I'm trying to contain the size of the project somewhat, but he had grand ideas about it. He wanted original works from prominent librarians and excerpts of the classics of law librarianship from the past. And it's still, I think, a tremendous collection. You contributed to one of the editions, didn't you?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. So all of the notables are represented. There are now 2 editions of the Spirit of Law Librarianship. And the more that we talked about it in Denver, about what this reader would look like, the more excited that I got, because I too was getting interested in mentoring librarians and education of law librarians. And this, I thought, would be a real benefit to everyone. And in fact, years before, I sat down, this will make me sound a little compulsive, and perhaps I am, but I actually sat down with, over a weekend, in the Law Library at Texas, with volume 1 of the Law Library Journal, and flipped through every single page of the entire run up to through the 80s, looking for articles that looked interesting. And I photocopied them. I've got them in a binder downstairs, what I consider the great law library journal articles of all time. So anyway, and just interesting tidbits. For example, there's an article in there predicting the death of law libraries from the early 50s. The death of law libraries because of the advent of loose leaf reporters. So there are some really interesting little tidbits in the Law Library Journal if you look through it. But anyway, so this book, Spirit of Law Librarianship, was going to give me an opportunity to go through that collection and compile them. Roy kind of burst a bubble that was then starting to grow in the back of my mind when he suggested that we do this book, but forego all the royalties, but use the royalties to go into funding an award that would recognize law librarians who use their skills in public service. So, I mean, because I was a striving, struggling young law librarian.
Of course, we're all at that stage at some point in our lives.
And so the opportunity to write a book, have my name on the, on the cover, and then not get any money for it, kind of broke my heart. But how do you argue when the money was going to be given to support, public service?
Mm-hmm.
So I was stuck. I mean, and I don't want to imply that I have any regrets about it. It was a good thing to do, and
oh, very much. Yeah.
So
very much.
the book eventually, I think was a great success. I think it's a terrific book. The award is one of the proudest things that I've ever done. We've now been giving the Spirit of Law Librarianship Award for however long that book was published. 20-something years, and we've recognized some tremendous people over the years and projects that have come to our attention. It's just been tremendous. The Rothman Company originally published, and Dick Spinelli was a big supporter of it. Then the project then was moved to Hine, and Hine's been a big supporter of the award and the Spirit of Law Librarianship. At one point we met, and I had been writing columns for Donna Heroy, who was the publisher of Legal Information Alert for years and years, and she told me that she wanted to start publishing a publishing division associated with Legal Information Alert. And that was right around the time when we started talking about doing a second edition of the Spirit of Law Librarianship. And so Alert Publications published the second edition of the Spirit of Law Librarianship. Ironically, in the end, Donna ended up selling Alert Publications to Hein. Now Hein owns the book again, and we're all back living happily ever after. Dick Spinelli is sort of has a permanent place on the awards committee, and sort of in Roy's honor, the director of the library at the University of Texas also has a permanent spot. And then the previous year's award winners, we had 2 this year, will also serve on the committee, and we'll look for new nominees and present the award again next year.
That sounds good. Now, you've been talking about one of your adventures in publishing. Another one I just want to sort of mention, the National Survey of State Laws, which you have written, and it's been in several editions, was named an outstanding resource by the New York Public Library, and it has also earned AALL's most prestigious Joseph L. Andrews Bibliographic Award. It was earned that in 2003. So in your own right, obviously, you're very accomplished as an author. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations to some of our newer colleagues about becoming involved in this sort of thing?
What I would suggest is for people to pursue opportunities, as they arise, and try to write as much as they can. Never presume that your idea, for a book or for an article isn't worth writing until you've pitched it to the appropriate people. And there are lots of opportunities out there. I, with my current staff, have been encouraging, I always do encourage them to seek out those opportunities and take advantage of them. I can guarantee you that any librarian in any station, anywhere, has at least 3 opportunities where if they were to write an opinion piece or an interesting little article about any aspect of law librarianship, there are at least 3 places where they could get it published tomorrow. Spectrum is an excellent place to get your work published. Whoever the editor is, I've been in that or close to that seat before. You're always looking for people to write. And if an article comes, a good idea, it's in. Your regional or chapter newsletter, SIS newsletters, they are also excellent sources. Now, people may say, but it's just a little, photocopied newsletter. Big deal. Well, it is. And maybe it's not a big deal. Your parents or your friends or family aren't going to walk into Barnes & Noble and see your name, with the mall newsletter collection in the rack at, Barnes & Noble. But that's not why you're writing. You have a much smaller audience, and your colleagues will read it, and it's a great experience. You put it on your resume. You've also shared your ideas with other people, and that is a benefit and a virtue in itself. The more that you do that, the more that you get your words and your name out there, the more you come to attention of other people who are looking for people who can express themselves and who and have ideas, either for programs or for books or this or that. The way that I got the job, ended up writing National Survey of State Laws, is a perfect case study in how this works. I believe it was Roy who originally got me in touch with the people at the American Reference Books Annual, ARBA, which publishes reviews of reference books annually. And it's widely held, or at least it was. I've kind of lost touch with it anymore. But I put my name on the list and I would do book reviews, probably did 4, 5, 6 a year. And it was through reading the reviews that I wrote for ARBA that Gale Research, as it was known in those days before it was bought out by whoever owns it now, Cengage, whoever that is. And then, but anyway, Gale Research Group called me and said, we are thinking about expanding our catalog to cover law books, because they didn't publish any reference books specifically relating to law at the time. Would you be interested in helping us develop some titles? And so they hired me, and I wrote up an essay outlining the needs that existed, in legal bibliography where they could publish books that would be useful. And any reference librarian who's ever worked in any place knows that one of the toughest questions to answer is when somebody comes to the reference desk and says, how many states have, a law about this? Or what are the laws in all 50 states? There are no national surveys. And so that was the topic that they picked up on. I worked with them. I worked with some wonderful people there. We developed the book, and then it went on. It was just incredibly successful right out of the starting gate. It won recognition from the New York Public Library the first year that it was published. Gale, who was an experienced reference book publisher and knew their business well, sold out of the first printing, ordered another printing, sold out of that. It went into 3 printings. And they're gifted. They know this stuff, and they didn't anticipate that it would sell that quickly. It's now, my kids, when they were growing up, used to love it. But I mean, their dad was a librarian, so whenever we traveled, we always visited libraries. Feel sorry for them. but every time we would go in and visit a library, the kids would run right up to the online catalog and look up my name. And National Survey of State Laws is just held everywhere. I found it in the Shanghai Public Library.
I imagine you would find yourself in an awful lot of catalogs.
Yes, and so the kids would just love it. We visited the Chicago Public Library one time, their beautiful new central library downtown, and the kids just fanned out, and each one went to another terminal, and then they started shrieking because it was an integrated catalog, and the Chicago Public Library had, I can't remember how many branches, 27, 29 branches. And there was a copy in each library, so when they looked up my name, there were 2 or 3 screens listed. So they all thought that was pretty fun.
Well, it's obvious.
So that's my advice to people who are writing. Keep on it and start little. I mean, and the reviews that I wrote for ARBA that led to this were 200, 300, 400 words long. I mean, really short.
Well, it sounds, Rich, like you have had a very interesting career. I know that you have done a lot of things and the various jobs you've had that we haven't heard about, but maybe maybe it's time to thank you for taking the time this afternoon to visit with us
Yeah.
and sharing so much about yourself and about some of the people that you have known in our profession. Before closing, however, is there anything that you would like to add as we conclude the interview?
Boy, you know, not really. I just feel so fortunate and so blessed to have found this profession and this career. It's one of those things. I was, going in one direction and all of a sudden ended up going in quite another one. It's been quite satisfying and fulfilling. Most wonderful people that you'd ever want to work with. It's a great community, and I really thanks for this opportunity to contribute to this project.
Okay. Well, thank you, Rich,
Yeah.
for your time this afternoon, and
You're
for
very
all the
welcome.
stories, especially about one of my favorites in the field, and that's Roy
Yeah.
Mirsky. And I had not heard about anything about how you got hired there, but that's a story in its own world.
It is.
And
It
in
is.
thinking of him, it doesn't surprise me now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome.